Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists did get it correct, and this is Tom Navolis, your host. And this week, as you saw in the promotion blog post for this program, kind of talk about Snarky Sam Adams, and maybe not so snarky, but you have to understand that Sam Adams was a master of language. Sam could be sharply critical by cutting deep into the psyche of his enemies with truth. And we need more of that. That was common during the founding era. So being snarky, there's nothing wrong with being snarky. And you have to understand that this period, during the 1700s in particular, sharp language was used in satire as well as directly attacking a person. All respectfully, of course. Sometimes not so much. This is important as I want to talk to you about hope, especially to those who were taken aback from last week's program. And there's a link to that in the blog posting for the program promo. So the hope is in that I want, and I'm talking about there is hope. And that's what people came back to me with. Is there hope based on everything that you talked about? There is hope. But the hope is relative to what I want you to think about with a solid footing, as well as through difficult alternative perspectives as to why we are seeing the evil predominate at all levels of government. This includes the family and church. There's a lot of evil even in the church. I want to challenge you, and I want to challenge your evangelical presupposition in politics, in family and church, as well as in work and business. You need to understand what's going on with that. And then what I want you to do is look at everything that I've proven in respect to what's going on relative to these concepts, or false concepts, if you will, of what? Christians in Congress. There's so much more. When I looked at last week and I introduced you to all the various facts of what was going on in that program in relationship to the conspiracy in Philadelphia, you have to take a look at that. And you have to look at what that means in every sense of Reformed Calvinistic truth. Now, what you have to be clear on is that I introduced to you last week also that those many so-called founders were Unitarians. They had that concept of God, but not what Sam Adams did. Sam Adams was a strong Trinitarian Reformed Calvinist. So much so that he lived his Calvinism in true covenantal manner regarding family, work, and his activities in the political sphere, to which he received the moniker the Last Puritan. And the historical facts are that those who landed on American shores, especially in the northern colonies, were Reformed Calvinist Christians. Very important to understand. And this is quantified by a Dr. Gary Scott Smith in a book, God and Politics, 4 Views on the Reformation of Civil Government. Some of this I'm taking out of polytheism and what was happening with that by Dr. North. So here is what this Dr. Smith wrote. Reformed theology was carried to the shores of America by English Puritans in the 1620s, from the founding of Plymouth to the American Revolution. About 80% of the colonists were adherents of Reformed theology who belonged to various denominations: Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Baptists, Dutch Reformed, German Reformed, and other smaller Calvinistic communions. So I want to continue with this, is that the major mischief that the vast majority of 19th and 20th century denominations have caused in compromising with humanism. They've compromised with humanism, beginning in those 1800s, beginning with those Unitarians. And as I always say, beginning in the mid-1700s with the Unitarians taking over the likes of Harvard and so on. So what we see in this period is the entanglements of an Enlightenment worldview, which opens personal and political polity to those humanistic pluralisms, which was the repeated downfall of Israel. And this is what Dr. Gary North talks about in Political Polytheism in relationship to Israel and even our present to this extent. So he quotes here, as I'm quoting him actually, is one reason why the Israelites failed to pursue a systematic program of world evangelism is because God's program required covenantal faithfulness, manifested in public justice and personal dealings, government, judiciary, business, relationships. These are relationships governed by God's law and enforced covenantally, family, church, and state. This program of world evangelism required the Israelites to obey God's civil laws both at home and abroad. Their failure to obey at home led to their failure to bring the message of spiritual deliverance to the world. Instead, they were repeatedly delivered by God into the world as foreign invaders captured the reins of power inside the nation, or else captured the people and sent them into slavery abroad. Dr. North says, it's my contention that the failure of world Christian evangelism today is to a large degree the result of a similar failure of God's people to proclaim and pursue covenantal civil standards for their own societies. They're at least, get this, you got to get this, because it's important, and we'll get into Sam, not so snarky and snarky, but you got to get this. This is important as to the problems we're having. There are at least 700 different plans for converting the world to Christ now in operation. Not one of them seems to be working well enough to offer much hope that the whole world will be converted in time to save the souls of some 5 billion non-Christian people who are already alive. What is the problem? There is one major problem. If the whole world were to convert tomorrow to the faith in Jesus Christ, American Christians, where the major centers of evangelicalism are located in the 20th century and even in the 21st, would be unable to answer the inevitable question, what should we do now that we believe in Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior? Americans have offered no explicitly biblical covenantal civil model to the world. So God withholds his Spirit. He has suffered enough embarrassment on this score already. He waits. He waits for American Christians to abandon their present mixed theology, the theology of religious pluralism. I've talked about that a lot at many different times, and to the extent why this nation is under judgment right now. You can find down in the articles for this week where Florida being polled is saying, oh yeah, we're going to vote for Trump, no question whatsoever, 49, 50+ % of the people. Yet, 60% of the people said that they will vote for an amendment that is going to be on the ballot to allow abortion to be put into the Florida state constitution. So I have to go on to this next section where Dr. North calls it intellectual schizophrenia. You get that? Oh yeah, we're going to vote for Trump, but at the same time, we're going to make sure that it's in the Constitution that people can get abortions. And yet we're trying to figure out where is government of the individual, the family, businesses, schools, everything in society has a covenantal relationship. No, they don't. They don't put God first. This is what I'm talking about. This is what I meant last week. So in this intellectual schizophrenia, Dr. North says this: it is clear to most people that in these final days of the 20th century, when he was writing this, anti-Christianity is triumphant institutionally and internationally. In the West and the Far East, humanism controls the media, the educational system, especially higher education, civil governments, and the economies of this world. It controls almost every visible institution. I mean, when you look at that, look, that's why you get this schizophrenia of voting for Trump, yet taking and putting, like they did in Ohio already, vote to put abortion, transsexual nonsense and all of that into the Constitution and the Bill of Rights here in the state of Ohio and what they're trying to do in Florida. Gary Smith, in his God and Politics, writes this. He says, Christians and Enlightenment worldviews, though resting upon very different presuppositions, combined to furnish principles that guided the development of the American political system. American society has continued to blend or amalgamate Judeo-Christian and Enlightenment principles to the present day. And this ideological synthesis still molds our political consciences and concerns. North phrases this and questions this ideological synthesis, and he continues with, what is remarkable? No. What is utterly astonishing is Gary Smith's continuing comment to the operational validity and moral integrity of this ideological synthesis. We have no choice in the matter, Gary Smith believes, since there is no explicitly biblical covenant model for civil government, to which I, Samuel Adams, Gary North, and a good number of other reformed-minded believers says there is a biblical model given, a Republican form of governance with God at the forefront. So I'm going to ask you this as we get ready to go into the next segment. So why is it important? Why is this important to understand this idea of the ideological synthesis that has happened with that commingling of the humanism? Well, I brought that out in a few programs ago, which there are links to in the newsletter. And it's important to understand with this most Christian Congress, more Christians in Congress than represent the whole United States. Yet, they violate every aspect of God's model for good governance because they are not moral, they are not virtuous, they are not even Christian. They're Christian in name only, except for a few. There are a few there in Congress, House and Senate, that truly are carrying out and living out their form, methods, and cries of governing well under God's reign. Come on back for the next segment as we continue. Welcome back to this second segment. And as we jump right back into why is it important to have that conversation that I did in the first segment relative to where's Snarky Samuel Adams, or maybe not so snarky in today. We'll give a couple examples towards the end if we have time. But you have to understand that there, not so much that the pithy Sam Adams believed, and he did, that there is that biblical model. So that's what I wanted to bring out. He did. He brought that forward. So Sam sets the Reformation biblical God at the head of the war for independence in his 1780 article signed Vindex. Now, before I get to that one, there was something that I wanted to bring out relative to the idea that he prayed for Reformation in his day. And the reason he prayed for Reformation in his day, because he knew, he saw what was happening even in the educational system of that time. What was amazing to me is that he was very concerned about what was happening there in Boston, and he was writing to his wife in 1778. And what he was seeing is that it was giving him great pleasure to see the ways that things were taking and recovering. He was seeing that there was God restoring his wife to good health and so on. But in the middle of this letter to his wife, he goes here, is that I exceedingly regret the loss which the town has sustained by the death of Dr. Eliot and Dr. Greenleaf. They died in war. They died in a battle. In times so degenerate as these are. At his time, this is 1778, he calls the times degenerate. He says, it is much to be lamented that men of such exemplary piety and virtue are taken away. I hope the depravity of manners is not so great as to exclude all hopes of children's rising up and serving God and their country in the room of their fathers. May heaven grant us a time of reformation. He was praying that. He was talking to his wife that there needed to be reformation in the churches even at that time. Is that snarky? Is that a snarky Sam Adams? Not really. I mean, that was most interesting in his reference to Almighty God. And now I want to take you back once again in this note of what he wrote in this article in 1780, signed Vindex, and you can find that the references there for you. And I'm going to pull some excerpts out. And here's one. He says that the conspirators against the rights and liberties of our country left no art untried to induce the people to submit to their unrighteous claims. But they were circumvented by our watchful patriots. They were, if I may use the expression, out-reasoned by some and laughed off the stage by others. And we will never forget those steadfast and persevering friends who forever proved themselves incapable of being bribed by the soft whispers of flattery or awed by foul-mouthed calumny and the threats of power. Afterwards, the contest became more serious and important. The people of this country were not driven to take up arms. They did it voluntarily in defense of their liberty. They properly considered themselves as called by God and warranted by Him to encounter every hazard in the common cause of man. very important principles just there alone. And just a quick note on them. They were considered themselves called by God. You can't consider yourself called by God if you don't understand what that means to be governed by God in that relationship with Him. So much more there. And then he continues with this: may heaven inspire that army yet more and more with military virtues, and teach their hands to war and their fingers to fight. May every citizen in the army and in the country have a proper sense of the deity upon his mind, and an impression of the declaration recorded in the Bible. So just with the army, with the citizenry, we just came out of the first great awakening. The people have a good conscience as to what it is to understand the biblical Reformation God. And this is what he's referring to here. And so what was declared, recorded in the Bible, is him that honoreth me I will honor, but he that despiseth me shall be lightly esteemed. We see that happening all the time. God helpeth those who help themselves, says an eminent writer. That's not scriptural, but an eminent writer says that. Perhaps the sentiment is better expressed in Holy Writ, where when we are bid to work out our own salvation, we are told that, quote, it is God who worketh in us, end quote. It seems to be the divine constitution that success shall generally crown victorious exertions. We have seen this verified throughout this glorious struggle. We have seen this verified throughout this glorious, he says that twice. It's verified through the struggle. The military skill and prowess of our army have kept us from being overwhelmed by our powerful enemies, and the political exertions of the Congress have, by the smiles of heaven, putting God first, as I talked to you last week about, that the Articles of Confederation make direct reference to God, obtained for us an alliance with the most illustrious nations in Europe. Now, and then in a long reply to Richard Henry Lee in 1784, Sam writes regarding the implementation of the Articles of Confederation, if, my honored friend, the leading men in the United States would, by precept and example, disseminate throughout the lower classes of people the principles of piety to God, to love to our country, and universal benevolence, should we not secure the favor of heaven and honor and esteem of the wise and virtuous part of the world? They kind of tie together. But once again, to my point from last week, and more so this, our pulpits make no such pleas, let alone for their congregations to come to piety to God, to love our country, and to universal benevolence, let alone the politicians, where they have no heart and mind for what Sam wrote. We talked about that in those other programs. In our present, most evangelical leaders want evil to increase so that the, quote, from Revelations 19:11 through 16, the white horse rider will rescue them. That's not God's plan. God's plan is for his church, for his people, to be the leaders, to be those that will take and act and live in that covenantal relationship in family, church, school, work, business, and government. Sam contended with Richard Henry Lee in 1784 that the seating of Congress under the Articles of Confederation, that there was a singular course should be for governing under the guidance of biblical covenantal God. His points included in December 1784, wisdom, firmness, and attention are the principles proper for our adoption. I agree with you and devoutly wish that every man who has a share in the administration of public affairs may possess a large portion of those and other great quality. By God's blessing on the councils and the arms of our country, we are now ranked with the nations. May He, God, keep us from exalting beyond measure. Great pains are yet to be taken, and much wisdom is requisite that we may stand as a nation in a respectable character. We're no longer respected because of the leadership that we have and the whatever you want to call the deep state, as well as those actively administering government. They could care less about God. April 1785 to Richard Henry Lee. I firmly believe that the benevolent Creator designed the republican form of government for man. Will you venture so far as to say that all other institutions that we know are unnatural and tend more or less to distress human societies? Sam lays it out. The question by that Dr. Smith, the question by others, the question that is out there to the pastors in the evangelical world, my question to you is not this, that Sam Adams and others at the founding of our time that were not the Unitarians, that were not the ones caught up in polytheism, everything works, and the ones that are not compromised with humanism. Can you not understand? The benevolent Creator designed the republican form of government for man. The example's well laid out in the Old Testament. There is an answer. There is the example of how we should take and have a civil society. Sam was always very concerned that under the new Constitution, and this is where he gets snarky later on, is that he asked, how is it, where is it that moral men were going to be able to execute that Constitution? How would they be able to do it if they do not have the God of the universe as the final authority in governing? If they do not have the biblical Reformation concept, principles, truth, facts that God rules the world and everyone is subject to His final authority. So in the last minute or so of this segment, I have a question, and should be a larger question, of what is virtue, morals, principles, and manners? How does that line up? How does that fit into everything that we're talking about in the snarkiness of Sam Adams, in the hope for last week's program? Well, I give you the definition of virtue there in the program notes at the end of the newsletter, so you can look that up to understand it from the foundational perspective, because it's critical that you understand what that is and how virtue is used during that founding era. Since our modern times, too often we have this fanciful concept of what virtue means, as well as abuse and trash the word, such as virtue signaling. We abuse it. We trash what the actual meanings of the word is. We're going to have to take the time into the next segment to get into, how does Sam, his observations ring in that rhetorical question about virtue? What is the specific list of hidden natured groups, a challenge to counteract our enemies, and encouragement to be a watcher? come on back for the next segment when Samuel Adams returns. Welcome back to this last segment of Samuel Adams Returns. And Snarky Sam Adams, where is he? We haven't gotten there yet. You're going, Tom, where's Sam Snarky? Well, you have to understand the setting, the virtue, all of that. And, we may have to hold the real snarkiness till next week, but hopefully I get to a few things. But what I was talking about was the idea and the question that is there on virtue, morals, principles, and manners. And Sam has this observation established here, and he goes on to say, should we not guard ourselves against British intrigues and factions? That can apply now, just change the words. Should we not guard ourselves of the deep state intrigues and factions, political factions, here at home, not even abroad? Her emissaries, which are ours and into the international world, under the guise of merchants, repenting refugees, schoolmasters, and other characters, unless care is taken, may effect another and fatal revolution. Do I need to go any further? Right there alone was established a warning in those groups of people. And we can replace anything with England. So he goes, the Commonwealth of England lasted 12 years, and then exiled king was restored with all the rage and madness of royalty. A caution to the citizens of the United States zealously to counteract the hopes of our enemies entertained of discord, disunion, and apathy on our part. Where'd you hear that before? I mean, those were warnings. That's now, ladies and gentlemen, that is now. To watch over public liberty and safety with jealous eye. Well, that's 100% commitment for me. And to practice the moral and political virtues upon which the very existence of a commonwealth depends. Are we really doing that? Are we? Consider how Sam Adams would respond to all this DEI insanity and such in the military lacking true sense of virtue. So this is perfect with what's out there from the people that are the citizen journalists in what they have taken and captured on the Air Force in particular. And so Sam goes on to write this to a letter to Samuel Philip Savage in 1778. You tell me that Boston has become a new city? And explain yourself by mentioning the exceeding gaiety of appearance there? I would fain hope this is confined to strangers. Luxury and extravagance are, in my opinion, totally destructive to those virtues which are necessary for the preservation of liberty and happiness of the people. Is it true that the review of the Boston militia was closed with an expensive entertainment? If it was, and the example is followed by the country, I hope I shall be excused when I venture to pledge myself that the militia of that state will never be put on such a footing as to become a formidable to its enemies. Think about that. With what we have going on in our military right now, how will we be formidable to our enemies? He continues, I am told that such a practice is contrary to the letter of the Militia Act by those who of all men ought to pay the most sacred regard to the law. Are we arrived to such a pitch of levity and dissipation as that the idea of feasting shall extinguish every spark of public virtue and frustrate the design of the most noble and useful institution? I hope not. Shall we not again see that sobriety of manners, that temperance, frugality, fortitude, and other manly virtues which were once the glory and strength of my much loved native town? Heaven grant it speedily. Wow, such a lot there. Talking about the destruction of the military. How about from the manifesto of the Continental Congress in 1778? Sam being a little snarky here, maybe. He writes this in regard to British treatment of prisoners as well as what they did to the communities. Quote, foiled in their vain attempts to subjugate the unconquerable spirit of freedom, they have meanly assailed the representatives of America with bribes, with deceit, and the servility of adulation. They have made a mock of religion by impious appeals to God, whilst the violation of God's sacred command. They have made a mock even of reason itself, by endeavoring to prove that the liberty and happiness of America could safely be entrusted to those who have sold their own, unawed by the sense of virtue or of shame. We have that now. We have these administration, all of these in political office that are unawed by any sense of virtue. And really, they don't care of shame either. A little bit on the snarkiness of Sam. Mostly you'll have to go through, there's a lineage of letters that are there. And I'm only using volume 4. He was even more snarky at the very beginning of the battle. But this in relationship to, and maybe towards, the Constitution. I don't know that I actually have one of those for you. But here's what Sam was writing, a little bit on that snarky side. I am at present in great haste, but as the supplement to my last letter, I will ask you, who among the sons of America ought to enforce the example of the illustrious young foreigner? Who is substituting other means of dissipation in my native town in lieu of theatrical entertainment? Who has mixed the grave and the vain, the Whigs and the Tories in scenes of amusement totally incompatible with the present serious times? Who among the grave do all of this? I mean, such Whigs as have feelings for their distressed country, and the multitudes of distressed individuals in it are presented at such entertainments. So they're presented in such highfalutin manners. Is there a man among them to whom our country has entrusted her independence, her virtue, her liberty? What can be the views and designs of such a man but to establish a popularity by forming a coalition of parties and confounding the distinctions between Whigs and Tories, virtue and vice? When I was last in Boston, I seized an opportunity to advise my fellow citizens to beware of their popular man, to penetrate their views and designs. It means look into what they're talking about. There was comparatively no great danger from a great man set over them by their British tyrant. When the people set up a great man of their own, their jealousy is asleep, and they are in danger of a master. I have no personal prejudice or attachments. Many things I have to say to you if I had the leisure. You know, there it is right there. Think about that. When you vote in who you think is going to be the right guy, you let your guard down. You are no longer jealous of your liberties. You go to sleep. Yeah, and I'm talking to all of you out there. We've seen it. Oh, yeah, I'm voting for Trump. Well, what about the rest? I'm voting for such and such as governor. I'm voting for this one. How did Soros get all his people in? You know, here's another one. Sam Adams writes in 1789, I have always been apprehensive that through the weakness of the human mind often discovered even in the wisest and best of men, or the perseverance of the interest in designing in as well as out of government, misconstructions would be given to the federal constitution, which would disappoint the views and expectations of the honest among those who ascended to it, and hazard the liberty, independence, and happiness of the people. He's getting a little snarky here, okay? He says, wait a minute, you know, because of the weakness, the sinfulness of the human mind, even somebody that you're going to put at the top of the stack will take and attack or allow to be attacked your liberties and independence, your happiness. I was particularly afraid that unless great care should be taken to prevent it, he's talking about the Constitution of 87, the Constitution in the administration of it would gradually, but swiftly and imperceptibly run into a consolidated government pervading and legislating through all the states, not for federal purposes only as it professes, but in all cases whatsoever. Such a government would soon totally annihilate the sovereignty of the several states so necessary to support of the Confederated Commonwealth, and sink both to despotism. We're seeing that in every state of these United States in our present age. Sam continues, I know these have been called vulgar opinions and prejudices. Be it so. I think it is Lord Shaftesbury who tells us that it is folly to despise the opinions of the vulgar. This aphorism, if indeed it is his, I eagerly catched from a nobleman many years ago, whose writings on some accounts I never much admired. Should a strong Federalist, as some call themselves, see what has now dropped from my pen, he would say I am anti-Fed, an amendment monger. Those are truly vulgar terms, invented and used by some whose feelings would be sorely wounded to be ranked among such kind of men, and invented and used for the mean purpose of deceiving and entrapping others whom they call vulgar. But in this enlightened age, one should think there was no such vulgar to be thus amused and ensnared. And he goes on to comment about the facts that we needed the amendments, and the amendments may be judiciously and deliberately made without partial or local considerations, that there may be no uncomfortable jarring among the several powers, and the whole people may in every state contemplate their own safety on solid grounds and of the Union. Which takes us in the newsletter back to the conspiracy in Philadelphia. And you need to go there and read that. And that the most striking feature in the Constitution of 1787 is the absence of an explicit acknowledgement of the deity or the Christian religion. Yeah, there's hope, ladies and gentlemen. There is hope. I want to end this program with that. But the hope has to return to a reformation in the churches so that the whole people will understand the need of covenantal government starting with themselves, their families, their churches, and then in government and justice. Come on back next week.